why I got interested in questions of identities, ethnicity, difference, and diversity is actually Vienna, where I studied with Walter Pohl, and from where I moved to Princeton some time ago. But Walter and I have been in touch and working together closely ever since. So I tried to tell Nino that with Walter you have the master in the room anyway, and that my contribution would be redundant. As you see, I couldn't convince Nino, and now you have to bear the consequences, and you will see that I was mostly right. However, what I can offer in addition to Walter is maybe to pursue the histories of ethnicity and its role in the management of diversity a little further in time in the post-Roman West. Let me just finish my email. So let me start by taking out one thread of earlier presentations, namely the recent trends in the study of identity and race, in particular in the United States, the pre-modern critical race studies. And it may be useful to linger a bit on the academic background in the United States. The adoption of critical race theory by medieval scholars is above all actually done and propagated by literary scholars in the United States and less so by historians. And many of them present race and ethnicity as synonyms and therefore as competing terms and concepts of the same subject. Some even go so far to claim that the choice for ethnicity is a deliberate strategy to avoid talking about race. This is, of course, not impossible and may well have been the case in the United States in the past decades. But if that is so, then this is, of course, an important issue to address as a political problem in the United States or the English-speaking world. And Walter has made some very important comments about particularly the discourse in the English-speaking world. I'm not so sure about the UK here, but maybe there are some people in the room. But at least in my field, in early medieval studies, as Walter already mentioned, our English colleagues are mostly notoriously oblivious to such terminological problems and tend to dismiss them rather as theoretical subtleties. However, to my mind, such a conflation of race and ethnicity runs into important analytical problems. As Rogers Brubaker and Frederick Cooper, and this on the handout, I think number 1, have reminded us in their important article on the study of identities, one of the challenges of the study of race, nation, ethnicity, or religious identities is that they are at once categories of social and political practice and categories of social and political analysis. The methodological problem can therefore not be solved with a more politicized terminology, but rather with a sharper and more precise methodological toolkit developed for and tested in the historical circumstances we want to study. This is, of course, not always entertaining, and particularly in the Anglo-American scholarly world, not very popular. But it is nevertheless important to deal with such complex topics, to deal with such a complex topic as the history of social identity. Let me discuss the issues at stake here with the help of an article, of an example of an article of Nicole Lopez-Janssen on the history of race and ethnicity from late Rome to post-Roman Italy. In her short article, she wants to propose a framework for early medievalists to discuss race. In doing so, she uses an example from the histories written by the Byzantine historian Procopius, who provides us with an interesting story about the education of Athalaric, the grandson and successor of the Ostrogothic ruler of Italy, Theodoric the Great, who died in 526. Theodoric's daughter Amalasuntha was criticized by members of the Gothic court to have her son Athalaric educated in a Roman manner. As for the Goths, so tells us Procopius, such an education was regarded as purposely making the heir of Theodoric weak, cowardly, and unmanly. For Lopez-Janssen, this illustrates how the Goths incorporated Roman racial formation and imperialist ideology by strategies of subversion and asserting Gothic distinction based on martial masculinity. As she concludes from this episode, and that's handout number 4, In the 6th century, new ruling groups in the post-Roman kingdoms, in particular the Ostrogoths, adapted and inverted Roman racial ideas drawn from classical ethnography and environmental theory, but functioning as a racial system in late antiquity to justify their privileged position. Well, this may work for an approach that wants to focus on potential layers of race making and race thinking and uncover blind spots in the historiography. From a historical point of view, it is less useful to study the emergence of new forms of political and social identity and the transformation of the Roman world. As more recent research has highlighted, the establishment of independent power blocks that were for a long time called the barbarian kingdoms was the result of an intensified interaction of barbarian armies and their rulers with the Roman Empire over a much longer stretch of time. Peter Brown described the various regna, little Romes, rooted in more restricted areas of control, and Walter Pohl called them kingdoms of the empire. What characterized all these kingdoms of the Roman Empire was the key to their success was the cooperation with Roman elites in these restricted areas of control, which was often based on an original mandate from the Roman state to take over the function of the regular Roman army in the various provinces. In a history soon written after the death of Theodoric the Great in 526 in Italy, the anonymous author put into the mouth of the Gothic king and governor of Italy, Theodoric, a telling aphorism. A poor Roman wants to live like a Goth, while an ambitious Goth wants to live like a Roman. The short sentence captures the position of barbarians who came to live in imperial territories in the transition from the Roman to the post-Roman world very well. They mostly occupied a social stratum that was strongly linked to their military function, and this military function defined social status and opportunities for these groups. In most of these settings, we can observe some kind of a labor division between the Roman civic population and the barbarian army, which, although a mostly heterogeneous group, became labeled in ethnic terms: the Gothic, the Burgundian, or the Visigothic exercitus. This is also well illustrated by the organization and reorganization of the Roman legal landscape in these kingdoms of the empire. In most of these kingdoms, we observe the emergence of a binary structure of two laws, one for the Roman population and another for the population whose ambitious members wanted to live like a Roman, but were not Roman citizens, such as the Visigoths in southern France and Iberia, or the Burgundians in southeastern France, or the Ostrogoths in Italy. And I basically outlined that on a map number 1 on the handout. In the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse in southern France, we know of two law codes that were issued around 500 on the initiative of the Visigothic king and the Visigothic court. One was a collection of laws for the members of the Gothic community in the last decades of the 5th century under King Euric, hence Codex Auricianus. The other was compiled soon after 500 and was an abbreviation and an update of the Codex Theodosianus under King Alaric. This breviary of Alaric, or it has also been called in the edition the Roman Law of the Visigoths, the Lex Romana Visigotorum, would have a long and very influential history in the post-Roman West, with hundreds of manuscripts and many different versions that were compiled and copied in the early Middle Ages. From the Burgundian kingdom along the Rhone, we have a much shorter collection of Roman laws, probably more to complement older Roman laws. Another law code was compiled under the title Liber Constitutionum. Walter has already given you an example from the Liber Constitutionum, which was a collection of laws or decrees of King Sigismund, also compiling some of the laws of the earlier king Gundobad. Gundobad died in 516 and Sigismund in 524. Like in the Visigothic kingdom, it guaranteed the non-Roman Burgundian population a status defined the juridical means of conflict resolution between Burgundians, but also between Burgundians and Romans, and even between Burgundians and other barbarians living in the regnum along the Rhone, as Walter has already shown in his quote from the Liber Constitutionum. The laws had not only the function to guarantee different populations their law, but also their social status that was defined by these laws within these more restricted areas of control of the emerging polities. This was the result of a longer learning process of members of barbarian armies or non-Roman recruits. As Avshalom Laniado has shown in his very interesting study on ethnos et droit dans le monde proto-byzantique, in the Eastern Roman Empire of the 5th century, proof of Gothic identity enabled barbarian soldiers in the Roman army to claim certain privileges that Roman provincial population who were not serving in the military would not have enjoyed. So these barbarian members of the military were certainly interested to present themselves as Barbari or Goti to enjoy the privileges that came with their military status. In a post-Roman kingdom, that may have been even more important when the Goti Burgundiones, or just Barbary of our documentary evidence, did not belong to Roman military infrastructure anymore. They were now a relatively small minority in a kingdom in which the large majority of the population was still Roman. The new law codes for the non-Roman population thus provide us with an interesting window into the process of how efforts to maintain social and political positions came to be connected to ethnic identity in these post-Roman kingdoms as minority groups. And this is something we have to keep in mind for the further history of the post-Roman West, and particularly for the history of the Frankish kingdom. The Frankish kingdom became the most successful and enduring successor kingdom of the Roman Empire, and the further development of post-Roman social and political experiments in the Frankish world played therefore an influential role for the further history of the categorical infrastructure of the post-Roman Latin West. The establishment of a Frankish rule over most of the former Roman of Gaulish provinces under Clovis I, soon after 500, however, had a slightly different history from those of other post-Roman kingdoms. Clovis's legitimacy was not primarily based on an imperial mandate for himself and his Frankish troops, but rather on the contracts he concluded with various elites in the different polities he came to rule in post-Roman Gaul. Already during his conquest in the north, or better north of the Loire, the northern half of modern France, negotiations with a different population such as the Roman kingdom of Soissons were more important than the military force of his army. The key to establish Clovis's rule were no negotiations with local and regional power blocks that guaranteed these communities a certain degree of autonomy in exchange for the acknowledgement of the king's legal and military authority. This meant not only new rights and privileges, but also the confirmation of laws and agreements that these communities had already developed before they became part of the Frankish kingdom. When Clovis established his rule over most of the former Gaulish provinces soon after 500, and therefore over some of the little Romes in southern France, this was also true for the institution and rights these little Romes had developed in the decades before, the Visigothic kingdom in Toulouse, and later the Burgundian regnum, roughly 2 decades after Clovis's death. As we can see already from the earliest manuscript, the Roman law of the Visigoths, the Burgundian Lex Romana or the Liber Constitutionum, continued to be used and copied in the Frankish kingdoms for many centuries. As a result, Clovis and his successor did not only come to rule a socially and ethnically quite diverse kingdom, they also reinforced or even multiplied this diversity in granting different groups or elites privileges, legal autonomy, and status from the start. In that situation, the Frankish kings presented themselves not so much as lawgivers like the rulers of other post-Roman kings in the south of Gaul or in Italy had done before them. They rather positioned themselves as arbiters between different legal traditions and legal communities of their kingdom. In doing so, they put themselves in an equidistant position to all the different groups and groupings in their kingdom, and thus in the center of a power balance that was hard to imagine without them. And Frankish groups became part of the social and political fabric as one group among others. When Clovis confirmed the oldest Frankish law code, the Lex Salica, it was one law code among others in the Frankish kingdom. The social hierarchies of these law codes and its regulations applied to a specific sphere of control or influence of this Frankish community. The distinction between one of these groups to other groups could not be drawn along the lines of a binary, but rather within a more complex pattern of diversity organized by the plurality of legal communities. In the course of the next 2 centuries after Clovis, who died in 511, we observe an increasing salience of ethnicity and ethnic categorizations to organize the legally pluralistic landscape of the Frankish kingdom, in a process that I would like to describe as a process from pluralism by default to pluralism by design. In this process, we observe not only the increasing salience of ethnic identities, but also the formation of a social imagination of the world as a world divided among peoples that helped members of these new polities to define their place and their relationship to each other in a larger social post-Roman whole. One of the most interesting documents for this process is the Lex Ribuaria, the law code for the inhabitants of the Eastern Frankish kingdom in the Rhineland area. It was issued in the 7th century, in the first decades of the 7th century, to organize the military and administrative structures of the eastern territories of the Frankish kingdoms. In this law code, we see the rulers organizing a system that allowed various legal communities to claim and secure one's status and rights as a free citizen in an early medieval state. This becomes particularly obvious in a title that grants every free man his own legal status. As you can see on my handout number 5, Title 35 of the Ribuarian law decrees that within the Pagus Ripuarius, every Frank, Burgundian, Alaman, or member of any other nation should be judged according to the law of the region into which he was born. In case of a conviction, he should consequently sustain the loss according to his own law and not according to the Ribuarian law. First of all, it's important to note that the personality of law, as it appears here, and also in other contemporary documents, has a territorial as well as a personal dimension of legal belonging. This becomes also obvious in a later title that elaborates on the status and relations of people who came from different regions. This is, as you can see from handout number 6. While a person born in the Pagus Ripuarius was classified as a Ripuarian, those whose origins were outside the territory were labeled as advene. The law also takes into account the different origins of immigrants and lists Roman, Burgundian, Frisian, Saxon, Bavarian, and also Frankish advene. The status of these different groups is defined in relation to each other by their weregild, the quite high compensation that someone who had killed another man had to pay to the family of the deceased person. In the Ripuarian code, the Roman advene were taxed much lower than other advene, while the status of other advene seemed to have been upgraded. This should not, however, mislead us to see this grading as an expression of some kind of ethnocentrism. The lex just continued the strategy that we have already observed in earlier post-Roman law codes. It helped to protect the status and claims of a group that saw its elevated position in society endangered by wider political and social horizons in which they became a minority group. In the Ripuarian code, the strategy was a bit more elaborated than in earlier law codes, as it also included collision rules, meaning rules to regulate how to handle conflicts between members of different legal communities. All people in the Rhineland were classified as Ripuarians, and that's subject to Ripuarian law. Other legal traditions and identities became relevant only if they had migrated into the region. If, for instance, a Burgundian had married a Bavarian woman, and both had come to settle in the Rhineland, where they finally, as it happens, were summoned to court, they would have to be judged according to Burgundian or Bavarian law. As much as this came to be a characteristic feature of post-Roman law codes, they still built on the Roman legal traditions, which had defined one's legal status with the help of the categories of origo and domicilium. The further development allowed various communities in the Frankish kingdom or its members to regularly adjust their legal status, protect the rights of immigrants, while it also guaranteed and probably even engineered the elevated status of local elites in the border region of the kingdom. Of course, what was at stake in the Lex Ribuaria was legal status and not ethnic identity. Not only did it help maintain social status and/or hierarchies, but also regulated what law a defendant could claim if he was pulled before a court. The categories that were introduced mitigated the issue of colliding rules between different legal orders and claims. Nevertheless, the imperative to provide a framework with which to manage these collisions indicates the increasing salience and politicization of ethnic categorizations in the 7th century. When the inhabitants of the Frankish kingdoms claimed these categories of Salian, Ripuarian, Burgundian, Bavarian, Alemannic, or Roman in the practice of law and court, the significance of ethnic categorizations was undoubtedly reinforced. And it was this system with which the legal landscape in the post-Roman Latin world was organized for many centuries to come. And in the following centuries, the legal structures came to coincide with ethnic structures ever more strongly. Let me conclude at this point. First, I hope that my few examples on the formation of categorical infrastructures in the post-Roman West showed that it is not very helpful to play off ethnicity and race against each other. Such a tendency is in the context of the medieval studies in the US often linked to efforts to study race making and race thinking in the pre-modern past. In order to do so, definitions of race and racialization become very wide in order to include ethnic categorization. A recent and in the United States very influential example is the study of Geraldine Henk that Walter already discussed in his talk. She suggested to define racialization as a process by which strategic essentialisms are posited and assigned through a variety of practices and pressures, and establish a structural relationship for the articulation and management of human differences. It's also on the handout. I don't find such an approach very helpful and would rather suggest to operate with sharper definitions or conceptions that allow us to explore race and ethnicity as overlapping but distinct categories, which in turn would enable us to study their respective interaction and, most importantly, their role, function, and salience in a wider categorical infrastructures of the societies and historical context we want to study. This is not only true for race and ethnicity, but other forms of social identity as well. Today, I've tried to illustrate this with the help of the interaction of legal and ethnic identity, where we were able to explore the increasing salience of ethnic identity in efforts to organize legal diversity. But processes and their interaction, however, have to be understood before the wider background of reflections on the changes in the categorical infrastructure. And we can observe this process in other sources too, such as the highly influential Encyclopedia of Isidore of Seville, the 20 books of his etymologies, which were written roughly at the same time as the Lex Ribuaria was issued. And you have the example on the handout number 8. Here, Isidore suggests a definition of gens and natio that represents a clear departure from Roman imperial worldviews, which regarded ethnicity as the feature of the barbarian or other world, as we heard from Walter. In Isidore's case, however, the promotion of this worldview is connected to the transformation, not to the transformation of the legal landscape, but much more blatantly motivated by his efforts to emancipate and to distinguish his post-Roman society from the old Roman Empire, as well as from the still existing Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. So what I suggest would be to study different forms of social identity, not only in interaction with each other, but also how the history of specific social identities is connected to the history of categorical infrastructures and how their place and salience within these categorical infrastructures shaped both the history of a specific social identity as well as the categorical infrastructure to which it belongs. The historical study of categorical infrastructure and their changes over time, their comparison in different societies and cultures may appear as a huge project, and indeed it is. But I think it might be possible if we work together or continue our work on different types and forms of identities, in understanding this work as part of a larger research agenda on the history of diversities and how social identities and categories are developed to organize and manage diversity. And here I think that Rachel has given me a lot of material to think about such comparisons in particular. And for such an agenda, I also find the intervention of the project of Torino very productive and important. And here I mean in particular how the project connects the reconstruction of categorical infrastructures or social categories in history to the social and political consequences for the making and enforcing of social hierarchies they engendered. The more I'm grateful that you allowed me to be included in this workshop and project and into the discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, you hear me from here, right?
Yeah.
So the only trick is that no, okay. So questions will be asked from here. So if you don't mind, in order for Helmut to hear you, you need to be here so that he hears through the microphone of the computer.
Great.
But first of all, thank you very much. We have been actually tiptoeing around this issue of formalized ethnic terminology that that kicks in the way a central administration deals with individuals, and it's something that we will want to think about some more. And of course, your perspective, I think, integrated what Walter was pointing to apropos the formation of these post-imperial entities where group identity of an ethnic kind seems to be the main identifying procedure for the ruling groups. I feel that something that we've been also tiptoeing around and never quite dipping into is the role of mobile military elites in creating these identities. Because after all, imperial armies, as anybody who studies the British Empire knows very well, are machines for the creation of ethnic identities, among other things. And one wonders in several historical contexts different from the British Empire, how much what we see presenting itself in our evidence as an ethnic group might really be military identities that become that acquire a name that sounds ethnic, that are created within an imperial army for the purposes of the imperial army, and then acquire a life of their own when the imperial army disaggregates for whatever reason.
Yeah, no, thank you, Nino. That's perfect, because I think that's precisely what I tried with this few examples in this 30 minutes also to show, but also to illustrate, at least with that examples, that if we are historians, so we have to give ethnicity a history, the chance to have a history as well. Right? And so the function of ethnicity in the late Roman Empire, and that's already clear in military context, has been highlighted in some important articles by Walter when he compared ethnic armies, or the armies that are ethnically labeled, with Roman armies. And he showed very clearly that, well, when a Roman army, after the commander is killed or unsuccessful after the failure, would just dissolve. An ethnic army seems to have already established itself as enough of a socially and politically coherent group to elect another leader. So that's already a difference. But once these armies came to live in a territory, in these areas of this little kingdom, in these kingdoms of the empire or the little Romes, this restricted area, that actually forces these groups to formalize, I think there's a perfect formulation, to formalize their status with the help of the ethnic terminology they have been using in a different context. And that, of course, changes then the form and function of ethnicity. And that history continues. But precisely because it starts to become politicized, its salience, I would say, in the early medieval evidence, it's clearly stronger than racializing tendencies. And actually, with this kind of plurality, it just doesn't function to operate here with a structure of diversity that would tend to organize the world in binaries. And that's a challenge. It takes some time. Walter and I have been trying to explain this is not something, that happens, because, well, now it's ethnicity and not that and not that and not that. This is a project that continues over several hundred years until it becomes more firmly established as a shared social view of the world.
Don't be embarrassed. Just if you want to ask a question, you just come here and speak into the microphone.
Yeah, that's the wie sagt man, Schwelle. That's the bar. You have to come out. That's a little, it's again too formalized.
Okay, I guess we're just too tired.
Sure. But maybe
okay, so I resist the temptation of chatting with you as everybody else.
and the people who
dozes off.
We can have we had this wonderful seminar, and you will actually hear the results of it in Oxford at the Program of the Ancient World meeting. And I learned a lot in the seminar about ancient Greece and about status and citizenship. And from Mark, we would have wished you here several times. But I think ancient Greece would be in many ways a very interesting comparison, or a field for comparison for these early medieval communities too, I'd say. So we can organize a double conference at another point when people are less tired.
Okay, so it seems like we are ready to call it a day. Yeah, I don't see any opposition to that. Okay. Thank you for joining us, Helmut. Yeah. This is made for some awkward timing at your end, I know. And next time we'll have you here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nino. Greetings to everyone and have a wonderful dinner. I heard the food in Torino is spectacular, and I envy you a lot.
Take care.
That we make for scattered around the different region parts of the world, so they can look depending how tired you are, and we'll be there. But before that, I want to thank you all very much for coming here to share your thoughts with us. It's been a great experience for me. I'm very interested in orality, but I come from the orality. So orality, don't worry, but I'll be haunting the speakers. in the not too distant future, discussing with them the possibility of spreading the benefits of their scholarship to a broader audience by way of training. But first of all, thank you so much for being here. Thank you.